So Brandon Darby, I will tell you a little bit about him. He's had one of the most interesting life stories of anyone that you'll meet. He's a conservative activist now, but he spent much of his life fighting for the left. Brandon describes his transformation to the right as a process. After turning into he turned in a Palestinian radical to the FBI for plotting to filter money to radical groups that were using the money to fund violence against Israelis. And then after that, he began to work as an FBI informant. And while working as an FBI informant, he helped expose and stop an attack on the 2008 GOP convention. Did you hear about that?
No.
That was in the works. This event revealed Brandon as an informant and quickly put him to the top of the list of the left's most hated people. He now works to expose the far left and those behind Occupy Wall Street. Brandon joined forces with Andrew Breitbart, Stephen Bannon, and a number of others for a film called Occupy Unmasked. Have you heard of that? Occupy Unmasked. How many of you have seen it? Just a few. Okay. We have that film, and in the next few weeks, we can play it at the office if you want to come and watch it. It's not a fun movie, but you should know what we're up against. There are ways to deal with it, but we can't be unprepared for it. That film takes you inside the Occupy movement and exposes exactly what they are, exactly who's behind them, and exactly where their funding is coming from. So what I'll do first of all, since we have a little bit of extra time, Brandon Darby and Andrew Breitbart they're cut from the same cloth. These people have taken on the left in a very effective way, and I want to just show you a little interview that Brandon did about Andrew Breitbart, and it talks about a little bit about his history and what he was up against. And it's just it's a scary position to be in for anybody, because they're not faking. They kill people. They intended to kill people. They will kill people again. So let me show you this.
Oh, wow. Okay.
The effect of Andrew Breitbart on him.
So I had turned on all of my comrades, and at one point I had a pretty prominent position in left organizing, and I felt rather alone. And when I started to work undercover with the FBI, I didn't really know how to perceive that. I just knew that I was doing the right thing, you know? So when my identity came out in a trial, which it didn't have to come out, but if it didn't come out, I was going to have to let these bomb makers walk, and I was like, that's not going to happen. So I decided to testify, and in our system, that means my name comes out. So my name came out, and I began to get attacked. And I began to see, like, even the wiki page for Common Ground, it used to be that the three of us founded Common Ground. My name was off of it. They just erased me. And all of a sudden, I wasn't Brandon who had had hundreds of media reports and nothing was ever bad about. I was Brandon the womanizer, the gun toter, I was abusive to ex-girlfriends, anonymous women were calling me a rapist, I was a child molester, I was all these things, you know, and it was all done to discredit me in my testimony, right, in a courtroom. Well, I prevailed, the guys went to prison in this one trial I was in, and then left media didn't drop it. They just kept beating away at it. And the ACLU got involved and started suing. And I mean, it was just this horrible nightmare mess. And all the while, I can't talk. So when I finally was able to talk back, and I would argue back, they would the major newspapers would either misquote me, or they would edit me down to say something bad. Even NPR and This American Life did that to me. They titled this hour-long show about me turncoats, you know? And so they just would not give me a break. And then this guy calls me and he says, hey, my name's Andrew Breitbart, and you bought a truck from my friend. I hope you don't mind that I'm calling you. And I'm like, what's up, man? And he said, well, thank you for what you did. And I said, that's really strange, Andrew, that you would say that, because no one other than FBI agents and a couple of people who would have been firebombed have said that. And right media at that time didn't know to defend. They didn't know to call it out. So I'm just sitting there alone with the left on me. And he says, well, why don't you fight back? And I said, Andrew, I do fight back. I just can't. They don't print what I say, you know, they misquote me, and they take things out of context. And he said, well, you can fight back on my side. I'm starting a site called Big Government, and I want you to be a part of it, and I will not edit your words, man. I don't care what your politics are, I don't care. And I was like, okay, sure. And then, he actually did. So the first day of big government, I got to hit Acorn, because Wade Rathke, I knew Wade, and he had attacked me horribly. He called me a snitch. He said, it's a shame that Brandon Darby was a snitch. And that's what he said about preventing people from getting burned. So he attacked, it was all this stuff. And then over a period of time, we just became really close friends. And one night we were drinking wine together. He liked to drink wine. And it was fun, talking and eating cheese and whatever. And we were talking, and he said, why do you do this? And I said, Andrew, for a lot of reasons. I think it's, I think that the right needs to know what's going on here and focus on these people in a big way. But my biggest reason is that I'm really afraid that my little girl's going to grow up, and one of these people are going to kill me, or something's going to happen to me, and all she's going to have to read about her daddy is what they say. I don't want her to see that. I don't want her to think. I want her to know my side too. And then he was like, brother, I will make you whole. And then I was like, sure, yeah. And do you know what he did? It blew me away. He came to CPAC, and he spent a bunch of time in his speech talking about me. And I was just like, what is this guy doing? Why is he doing this for me? Like, he has no benefit to do this for me. And he just started talking about me everywhere he went, and telling people to meet me and listen to my story. And the next thing you know, my story started to be told, and then people started asking me to talk at tea parties, and I started to go talk and just tell my story. And that's turned into my whole life now. It's just like telling my story and talking about my views and what I think. And it's all because of him, So it's all because this one guy, for no good reason what I can see whatsoever, just felt like I had been done wrong. And he decided to make me whole. And then what was weird is he did that for so many hundreds of other people, That's what he did. So yeah, we talk about Andrew. I mean, my mom, my grandmother, someday my little girl, I can't even begin to describe what he did in my life, so.
Pretty amazing, pretty amazing. People wonder what happened to Andrew Breitbart. Okay. Now, the other thing I want to show you is the actual movie, Occupy Unmasked, which a few of you have seen. But this is just the trailer for it. It's not rated for primetime TV. Think cable, but it's worse. This is live for them. Here we go.
Mic check! My name is Dylan, and you should be very proud of what you have accomplished.
I agree with your goals. Occupy Wall Street.
Responsibility. It's young. Spontaneous, and it's going to be effective.
I'm so impressed by what I'm seeing here.
Protesters are giving voice to a more broad-based frustration about how our financial system works.
Here is a real grassroots movement, unlike the Tea Party, which is a manufactured movement.
We call it astroturf. It's not really a grassroots movement.
The problem with the Tea Party movement is they're just sewer rats.
They can't continue to be pulled to the right by the radical, unrealistic, unreasonable, I repeat, radical and unpopular faction, the Tea Party.
Hello, citizens of the world. We are anonymous.
I say take the FBI, the CIA, and go back to hell where your fucking guys are.
Cameras caught evidence of drug use and paraphernalia.
Like, you have hippies in the book that actually take acid every day.
Hey, asshole!
This woman who didn't want to be identified claims she was raped here in one of the tents.
You're gonna get fucked up.
Why are you considering one's leg? Why would you do that?
It has become a very big concern around here. They're starting to even assault one another.
I kind of like it that they're sort of militantly vague at this point.
We are finally telling you the true story of the radicals behind the Occupy movement.
Occupy San Francisco, occupy LA, occupy DC, and occupy Chicago.
He's here. Please help me welcome Brandon Darby.
you. Awesome. How's it going, guys? Would everyone say hello, Olivia? Olivia's in the back. Hello, she bumped her head on the 4th of July and had to get stitches. And how many of you have children? How many of you have a little girl? How many of you remember the first time you had to get stitches on a little girl? I do. That was horrifying. All the things I've been through in my life and seen, and nothing made me want to pass out like seeing my little girl with a head injury. And so she had 5 stitches and had to get them taken out today. So I rushed here as quick as I could. But, you know, it's good to be here. I was really happy that I walked in and I saw you all watching the trailer. How many of you have heard of this movie before? Yeah, good. That's awesome. That's awesome. And how many of you have heard of Hating Breitbart, another film about Andrew Breitbart? Yeah. Okay, how many of you haven't heard about Andrew Breitbart? Okay, good. So all of you know Andrew. I know of Andrew. Okay. He absolutely, in human terms, you know, he's like I said, in human terms, he's a savior to a lot of folks, you know. He helped a lot of people, and he helped me. You know, I don't know, I've kind of been in this thing lately where I haven't wanted to go talk anymore, you know. For the last couple of years, I've spent the majority of my time, you know, my daughter and I do not live in the same house. I get her every other weekend, and then I get her for extended periods of time in the summer, and all the normal, unfortunately normal way things are with a lot of families now. And other than that, I've spent the majority of my time in the last 2 years traveling and talking. So there's a lot of times that a month will pass and I don't spend more than 3 or 4 days at my actual house. And I kind of got to a place where I don't want to do that anymore. And so I've tried to just be more reclusive. But I'll never say no to talk at small tea party groups. I never will. And that was something Andrew taught me. He reminded me that, you know, a lot of people try to start what is the word I'm looking for? I guess they try to start their career, or they try to make a lot of profit off of the Tea Party movement. And I've never really thought that was a good thing. I mean, some people have different views, and that's fine. Just like some people with churches have different views, and they're okay with large salaries, and I'm not that person, you know? And I'm not that person with the movement either. I take it pretty seriously. And so I'm glad to come here. It just worked out perfect. My mother lives in Houston, and I was bringing my daughter to Houston around this time anyways, so it worked out great. You know, my situation, how many of you know anything about my story? Went through the whole, okay. So my situation is a strange one because most of my views are considered right of center views, you know, and in fact a lot of them are considered pretty far right of center by some people, especially apparently by a lot of Republicans, apparently by the way they vote, you know, and so forth in Congress, and some of the things they say. But I kind of come at it from a different place, you know, like I wasn't really raised patriotic or political at all. I just wasn't. I wasn't raised that way. In fact, as I grew up, I was very, very liberal and very left of center, you know? And so all of the positions I hold are positions I hold for, I can give you an answer for everything I think. I'll put it that way. I can give you a good answer for everything I think. There's nothing that I think just because I think it or because I was told to think it. In fact, there was a time in my life where I was actually very ashamed. I'm going to tell you now, I was ashamed to be an American. I was ashamed of my country, ashamed of everything, the evils that we had done across the world, you know? And I did what most left of center people do, and that is I blame the world's ills on the United States of America, and on our system, our economic system, you know, and our views on private property and exploitation and all. That's where I came from. And things happened in my life, and there's really no other, I'm not going to get into a preaching thing. I mean, I smoke cigarettes, I'm far, far from perfect, way out there, don't worry, I'm not trying to preach at you, but I'll tell you this, there's really not there's not too many ways to explain how someone like me had the life experiences I had that got me to where I am now, you know? But I'll try to do that a little bit tonight. I'll try to explain the situations and the circumstances that took me from being a revolutionary. That would have been funny years ago, but it's not so funny now, is it? That I was a revolutionary. People in the past would have said, that's ridiculous, but now you're like, oh yeah, we have some of those in our government, you know, and leadership, which is a fact, we do. But you have to understand, okay, I was born in Pasadena, Texas. How many of you know about Pasadena, Texas? Yeah, I was born in Pasadena, you know. My dad was a welder, you know. My mother worked in a medical office, later became a nurse, but that wasn't until much later in my life. And at the age of 12, they divorced, and I went through, you know, I took that a little harder than most people did. There was a lot of stuff going on, but I ended up running away from home. And I was just hard-headed enough to stay away from home long enough that it kind of turned into me spending the better part of my 13th and 14th year as a runaway in Houston. Well, naturally, you can imagine the things that I experienced and the bad things that occurred in my life and the people that took advantage of me at that age and the people that used me to do bad things and all the horrible things that you can imagine happens to a runaway at that age, right? And somehow or another, I ended up at about age 15 not being that way anymore. I started living with my grandmother, and I didn't want to have that life. You know, I don't know why I didn't want to. What I mean by that, of course I didn't want to, but I don't know why that spark happened in me, right? Because most of the people I had run away with, or I used to drink and sneak cigarettes with, and all the other bad things that I did as a teenager while I was running away and prior to running away, most of the people who did those things with me are now dead, or they're incarcerated, or they have horrible, horrible lives that are in and out of treatment centers with addictions and horrible experiences, right? And I didn't turn out that way. But you know what? I always felt from that period of time, I felt like I had survived a plane crash, you know? And like, imagine if you survive a plane crash and you're the only one who walks off the plane, right? And you're like, well, why did God, or why am I still here? Why? There's a reason for it or something. Well, so I always had this thing inside of me where once I started to grow and I got to be 6 feet tall and put on some weight and, you know, and then I did some martial arts classes, like, you know, because I really didn't like being beaten up or taken advantage of and all that stuff. I started to have this thing where I hate bullies. I just hate bullies. I hate them to death. Like I hate what's behind it, right? People who are in a position of power to take advantage of people who are weaker than them. It makes me so mad, you know? Always has. And so naturally, living in the world we live in, you might not agree with it, but most people in our society actually believe this false narrative that says if you care about other people, then you're a liberal. And if you want to worry about fiscal responsibility, then you're a conservative. If you care about what happens to others, you're a leftist. If you don't, you know, you say, why do you vote for Barack Obama? I vote for Barack Obama because I care about other people. I care about the little guy, you know? That's what they say. Well, I, of course, bought into that dominant narrative, and I ended up moving into Austin when I was like 20 years old, and then I had all this passion as an activist to get involved and to help people, right? And I hated bullies, so I would just stick it to people I thought were taking advantage of people. Well, people took my passion. People, when I volunteered at nonprofits and so forth, they started to take, older people realized that passion. Some very prominent leftist-centered people. How many of you have ever heard of the SEIU? Where their chief organizer, Lisa Fithian, took me under her wing. And she lives in Austin, so she met me. She took me under and started to educate me. Well, some other prominent people, like a former Black Panther Party member who's very prominent on the left, named Robert King Wilkerson, took me under his wing. And they began to educate me and teach me, like I guess they politicized me. They taught me to look at things in a bigger context. They taught me to organize. They taught me that if I have a problem with something that I think is wrong, rather than just go and complain and tell people about it, I can get other people to do it with me, and then I have so much more power to change what's wrong, right? So they politicized me and taught me. Well, so not too long after that, I started to have some very radical political views. And so all of that anger in me that I had from things that happened to me as a runaway, right? And all of that drive and passion I had to stick up for people who I thought were powerless and being exploited, all of that passion to change things and make the world a better place, those people took me under their wing. They trained me and they taught me, they involved me, and all of a sudden I got to meet all these really big people in the movement who were kind of famous activists and famous journalists and famous whatever. And so I kind of just fell right into that with all of this passion. But you know, a couple of weird things happened. So I started to make a name for myself, and I didn't mean to make a name, I was just pretty radical. But I started to make a name for myself, and I got to hang out with all the famous leftists and the far leftists and all this stuff. And then one of those far leftists moved to New Orleans, and then Katrina happened, right? And when Katrina happened, I got wild and I went and got my friend, you know? But it turns out my friend was this famous former Black Panther Party member, and it turns out going to get him wasn't so simple, you know? How many of you remember all the images of all the people on TV dying and screaming for help? Remember Katrina, remember this stuff? Okay, well obviously that probably crushed your heart too. Let me tell you something. One of the things I noticed was that I wanted to go get my friend. The activist community thought it was crazy to go get him, you know, Robert King Wilkerson. So I went to Academy and I bought a 14-foot John boat with a 10-horsepower Mercury motor and a bunch of gear that this guy, who was a former Special Forces guy, who used to argue with me all the time, and I thought he was a baby killer. I used to think that way, you know? Completely dehumanized soldiers and cops and everyone else. But he would argue with me at cafes. Well, he liked what I was doing. I told him, and he goes, well, let me give you some tips on how to like stay alive if you're gonna go do this. And he said, here, you're gonna need this, you're gonna need this compass, this is how you look at it, here's a little chart for you, here's some maps, here's what you're gonna need, here's how you purify water, here's how you get fuel, here's how, and I was just like, whoa. So I got all this stuff together, and I went to get my friend, and I got to New Orleans, and when I got to Baton Rouge, that's where the Red Cross had their big hub, all of the federal and state agencies were fighting with each other, right? And so myself and 270-something other boats showed up. And 270-something other boats across the country means each boat has 2 or 3 or 4 people on a team. So probably around 1,000 human beings from across America showed up on day number 2 or 3 to help other Americans that they saw in trouble, because that's what we do, right? Well, the government sent them away and said, well, you know, it's Wildlife and Fisheries said it's our responsibility, and then FEMA was like, no, we're doing this, and then everybody started arguing over who was supposed to go do the search and rescue. So they sent us away and said they had it under control. And they didn't have it under control because after 2 or 3 days, then you have a problem with people had no water and food, their grandmothers died, their babies are now dead, and people were tripping at that point. Then you had a whole different situation, which then government justifies not going in because they say, well, it's unsafe for us to go in, you know? And it's like, well, it's only unsafe for you to go in because you've made all these people think that it was safe, that they could depend on you, right? You trained them to think they could depend on you, and now they do depend on you, and then you left them to die, you know? And so it's a kind of complicated argument there. You say, well, we shouldn't have to owe it to them. Well, yeah, but if you tell them you owe it to them and make them think that way from childhood, then it kind of gets kind of complicated, right? As far as their perspective goes, at least. Well, so anyway, they sent us away, and me being the activist that I was, and the kind of, remember that radical thing I told you about, the radical part of me? I was like, you know, I'm gonna go in anyways and get my friend. So I figured out if I went around Lake Pontchartrain, through St. Tammany Parish, and if I put my boat in Lake Bourne, which is actually kind of the open ocean, then I could get in, back into Pontchartrain, into the Industrial Canal, and get into New Orleans, right? Well, let me tell you something. I did get into New Orleans, but I tell you what, it wasn't easy and it wasn't fun. It was really scary. And it turns out those flat-bottom boats aren't for the ocean. Well, I had never done it. I didn't know, I don't even know, I still don't know what you call it. If I'd ever driven a boat, rowed a boat, I don't know what you, floated a boat, captained a boat, I don't know what you call it. But I don't know. I mean, I just don't know anything about boats. But I did it anyways. I got in the city, and then I realized something that was really, really strange, is that I couldn't really help too many people because, like, if you don't realize this, but if all of you were sitting, and this is dry land, right, and you're surrounded by water, and all of you have babies or grandmas with you, and they're about to die, right, and you need water, and I only have a little bit of water, and I pull up in a boat and can only take 2 or 3 of you, we have a problem here because every one of you, maybe a couple of you will be saints, but the majority of you, after that many days in the heat without food and water, you're all going to want your loved one in my boat. And then you're going to start fighting each other. And then you're going to try to take my boat when I won't let you in my boat. And I started to realize that helping people wasn't so simple. Like, why don't you just go help? It's like, well, it's not that simple. There are reasons, there are things that happen that make it very difficult to help people sometimes. So anyways, I ended up having to leave in shame and in horror without having gotten my friend. I helped some people, but not as many as I meant to help, you know? And I somehow managed to get back in my boat, and I had drawn on napkins and papers and stuff when I'm in the boat, you know, trying to make some kind of map about where I was to go. And do you know, I somehow made it back to my truck, you know? And there was no boat ramp. So there had used to be beach houses there. You could tell they were understood. But so I managed to get my boat out of the ground, out of the water. I had been smart enough to bury fuel and hide it, because people took my fuel, and I got out of there. And then I realized when I got to Lafayette, Louisiana, I went to a Taco Bell, and everybody was just like, water was flowing, because I had just spent a whole day, about maybe 30-something hours, having to like measure how much water I drank, you know, to make sure I had water. You think, well, there's plenty of water around. Well, not water you want to drink, you know? Well, anyway, so it was really, I remember this concept, I was like, wow, these people are just right here. And their minds, like, I know now their minds are just so ingrained to let DC take care of it, that these people right next to them, you know, were just going about their lives and not caring, you know. They had plenty of water, but it takes people bringing water in from all over the country, even though their water's flowing fine, for these people to be okay who are their neighbors. We'll get to that later. You know? But that made an impression upon me, right? Well, long story short, I go back to Austin. People mocked me in the activist community. They told me I was a wingnut, and I shouldn't have done that, and I should have listened to the community's consensus. Up twinkles, down twinkles, you know that stuff, right? Well, all that stuff from Occupy, this is the same groups of people, that community that I used to be a part of, who are, that's where all this came from, all those memes they use, you know, like up twinkles, down twinkles, oppression, brother, don't speak in oppressive manners. Like, let's have group consensus before we do anything, right? Because we all belong to each other, and all this stuff that creeps me out now. And it kind of creeped me out then, to be honest, now I look back at it. I didn't really fit in too well, because I don't like that. Like, we belong to each other. It's like, no, we don't, you know? We really don't. But long story short, I get back. Well, then this other former Panther, who's also kind of famous, named Malik Rahim, calls me. And he says, hey, we have this problem. We have this white racist militia working with these black cops, and they shot an unarmed black guy who lived here because they were telling him to leave, and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, okay, so I got it was totally legal, but it's a little sketchy, I acknowledge that. I got a bunch of guns, I got an eco-terrorist, and a bunch of other militant people. We went back, went to this Panther's house, and then, like, it turns out right now, I know it sounds crazy, but listen to me, it actually were a couple of bad cops in the NOPD, they are now incarcerated because they actually worked with a group of racist guys in Algiers Point to shoot unarmed black people and burn their bodies. Don't ask me why, but they did it, and they're in prison for it. So it sounds crazy, but they did it. Well, so here I am with my anger towards bullies, right? And all of my elders and teachers and mentors being these former Panthers and these radicals, telling me all this stuff about law enforcement and the pigs and the blah, 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 blah. And then I go in this situation, and I somehow find myself with these Black Panthers in a house with an AK-47, which was legal and bought at Cabela's, but it's still an AK-47. And these cops who kill black people and are burning their bodies. So in my mind, it just kind of reinforced it all, right? I was like, oh my gosh, there really is a war against the people, you know? The pigs are at war with the people. That's what I was thinking. I was like, ah. But see, what happened was rather than us have this showdown with the police, people like Michael Moore, and as much as I dislike his politics, I'm glad he did this, you know? And people like Medea Benjamin showed up and they started giving us money, and so why don't you start a relief organization and help people? So it turns out having a bunch of former black militants with AK-47s to protect you is a lot less safe than having a bunch of women in pink shirts planting flowers, right? With cameras going and money. So anyways, I somehow survived that. And then I found myself in this position where the three people who co-founded the organization, myself being one of them, right? I had no idea how to co-found anything. I was like, I had a small concrete business, right? Not a co-found a relief organization. I just did something crazy. Well, long story short, I go across the river, I go get my friend. It was this whole long story. It got a lot of media attention. I got my friend Robert King Wilkerson. Then all of a sudden we had all this media attention, all these resources, and all these people wanting to help out. So what we did was we took the anti-war community, right? And then we mobilized them into a funding mechanism to help people. Like actually help people and do relief work. And it worked. So lo and behold, me never having really fit in with these people, but always having been admired to some extent because of my radical passion, which I would rather not have, but I couldn't not have because I had been a runaway and had all this stuff happen and got left feeling like I should help people and like I owed that to humanity or something. There I found myself in this position with like $3 million and like 24,000 volunteers. Or 23,000, whatever, 20-something thousand people, you know, wanting to help in a short period of time with a lot of money. And then the person who was really the head guy of it, Malik Rahim, said, well, you know, why don't you run the Ninth Ward in the inner city area of New Orleans? And I'm like, dude, I'm white, I can't. He goes, yeah, I know. You know what? They're not here. Let them, teach them a lesson. Just go run that area. That's your area. You run it. If it fails, it fails. If it wins, it wins. And you run it how you want. Here's the money you have. Do how you want to do it. I said, okay. Well, sure enough, it started to make some people mad. People who weren't even there. There I was living on a dirt floor, helping people, literally on a dirt floor, right? Helping people, getting infections and getting bit by things, and it was rats flying. And people had, like Cornel West, had the guts to insult me for being a white male in a position of leadership in a black community. And I'm like, well, what's the problem here, you know? You're not here. So I said, come here and do it yourself. I promise, I'd love to go back home to Austin, you know? I would love to. My business is suffering. I'm about to have to sell my equipment to pay for my shop. Come on down. Sleep on the floor here. Do what I'm doing. You take it over. But nobody wanted to take it over. They just wanted to complain, right? And so what happened was I found myself without any organizing skills whatsoever other than having run a small business, you know, in charge of this, the aid and the relief for this massive area in inner city New Orleans, the Ninth Ward and the lower Ninth Ward. And then Lisa Fithian was in charge of another region of the city. And she was the anarchist Occupy crowd, but they didn't call themselves Occupy yet. And then other people had other regions of the city and the state, right? But I had the hardest hit area. So I ran it like I was the boss. I found out that people kind of appreciate having a number and a name they can call who they know is the bottom line. People didn't like that. They're like, well, brother, we want a consensus process. And I'm like, well, I don't want a consensus process because you people don't do what you're not responsible, you know? Like, you can't do that. It's not fair. Like, if you want to try your consensus theories and when you're at universities or in a class, that's awesome. But don't try it and use, like, the black people in New Orleans as lab rats for your philosophical experiences that Marx thought of, like, 100 years ago or something. You know, like, don't do that, you know? It doesn't work. And one of the examples of how it didn't work was like Lisa Fithian. We had this, it was the first time we had a whole, like, hundreds of people coming at one time to volunteer. And they set up this center, and it was by the train tracks, and it wasn't in my Ninth Ward and my lower Ninth Ward, so I had no control over it, right? I couldn't run it. It was Lisa's project. It was the anarchist, anarcho-feminists Occupy project. And the way that they decided to appoint somebody, the roof had been ripped off, and they needed to tarp it and do all this stuff, and it was going to house hundreds of people, right? And we had storms coming. And I told her, I said, Lisa, we got this guy who volunteered, he has a big roofing company. Like, let him fix the roof, let him tarp it up. And she goes, well, I want to empower this guy. And I'm like, I understand you want to empower a 17-year-old transgendered male or person who has no life experience, and I know you want to empower him, Lisa, and I understand politically that that's what we do, you know. I was like, but in this situation, considering the consequences, I really think you ought to put the person who has the skills to do it. No, she insisted on empowering the person. So she appointed leadership based upon who she wanted to be the leader versus who could actually get the job done, even though other people's lives and safety and well-being was at stake. And I began to realize, like, there's something different about me from this person who I always have looked up to. There's something different. And I could go on and on and on. I had a kitchen, and the kitchen was the only source of food for black residents in the 9th Ward for a very long time, because I don't know if you realize this, but that local corrupt, predominantly Democrat, but that's not why, there's that local corrupt government. How many of you don't think New Orleans has some corruption in government? Okay, Louisiana? Okay. That local corrupt government had decided that the people who lived in certain areas weren't going to get to come back home. And they tried really hard to make sure that those people didn't come back home. But it just so happened that was my area. So I said, well, wait a minute. I said, most of these people, they have like 97% home ownership in these areas, right? Low income, working, not on social programs, black residents, owning homes that their grandfathers built with their own hands at a time when that land was just swamp and nobody wanted it, and that's why they got it, right? But a time when it wasn't so fair in America. Those times existed, and that back then that's what they did. Well, they turned it into a pretty nice little area, had some problems, but it turns out it's right by downtown. Well, it turns out developers wanted the land. The city tried so hard, and so I started to do media interviews, and I said, wait a minute. I said, this is going to be the largest use of eminent domain for private commercial development in U.S. history. Like, you can't, what is this going to do to private property rights within Medea Benjamin and Lisa and Malik? Like, yo, bruh, we don't support private property rights. So this is a marginalized community of color. And I'm like, no, this is a bunch of Americans who are about to have their private property rights violated. They're like, yeah, but we don't support private property rights. I said, but I do. You know? I was like, so anyways, one of the things that happened in that situation was, like, we had this kitchen, right, in the upper 9th Ward, and it was really necessary for people because we had this strategy, and the strategy was real simple. So, okay, they're trying to take this area, so what we're going to do, as much as the house has been under 15 feet of mud, we're going to gut it, clean it out, tear the sheetrock out, put sheets up for walls, right, and we're going to convince somebody on each block in a grid pattern to come home. We're going to provide a generator. We're going to have them help us work with other residents. And then there's not going to be any huge swath that developers can take because there's going to be a resident home on every block in this grid pattern. Well, you know, it worked. It worked. You can't argue with that and say residents don't want to come home, and they wanted to come home. It worked. So that's what we did. So that was a project. So we had this kitchen, and we were fighting, and we were feeding people. And then people said, well, we don't want to serve oppression in the kitchen. And I said, what do you mean? And they're like, well, you know, we don't want to support systems of oppression, Brandon. And I said, well, what do you mean? They're like, well, we don't want to serve, you know, animals. We don't want to serve animals. And I'm like, okay, look here. Check it out. As a Southern man, I appreciate you coming from Berkeley and Harvard and everywhere in the world to come and help us. It's so sweet of you. But we don't need you to correct our eating habits, right? Like, come on, you didn't come here to teach black people how to eat correctly. Come on, man, come on, you know? So we had these fights where they had their anti-oppression kitchen. And then they like, man, it made me so mad. It made me so mad. Because it made me feel like they were using, again, black people as lab. We're gonna teach the we're the ones who are racist somehow, right? But then they're gonna make sure the black people eat correctly, you know? Now who sounds more racist? You know? But I started to have a problem with that, right? I started to have a problem with that. One of the things that was a problem for me was this kitchen. Check this out, this is significant. Listen, listen, listen. This kitchen, these people came in, they provided the food, they provided the cooks, they provided the schedules, they provided everything and told people how it was gonna be, and they had it all worked out to a T so that the people eating in the kitchen ate correctly and and ate at the correct times, you know, had the 4 meals a day of smaller quantity because it was better for them. I mean, seriously. And do you know, months later, and it was in my area, but I couldn't do anything because it affected the whole group, right? And months later, it was all still the same white volunteers. Nothing's wrong with being white. I'm white. I'm not saying that. But what I'm telling you is the residents didn't get involved in helping each other. And I couldn't figure it out, you know? And I was like, this is weird. Why don't people want to get involved and help us help the community and da-da-da-da? So when I opened the lower Ninth Ward kitchen, I said, I have an idea. I'm going to try something different. And I went to the community as it started to come back, and I said, here's the situation. There was a lot of radical stuff involved. Like, it was illegal to go there. I rented a property, which made it my private property, at least that's what I argued. And I moved in the house. It was still covered in mud, and then I did interviews every night from the house, and the police said they were going to arrest me for being there illegally, but then none of them would arrest me. You know, it was just a big media thing, right? And then I called Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackson, and I do have Al Sharpton's valet cell phone. And that dude wanted 10 grand to come to New Orleans and help. And he wanted me to put him up in a hotel. And I was like, oh, bro, oh, no, you know? So that kind of broke my heart. But my point is this. Once people came back, I said, here's how we're going to do it. I said, look, guys, we have this building, we have these stoves, we have these pots and these pans, right? This is the minimal amount we have, but this is what we have for food. What that food is, I don't care. Whatever you people eat, eat. Like, I don't care. Whatever your community eats, eat. You know? But here's the deal, I'm not cooking for you, and if you guys want to cook for your community or help your community or whatever, you guys need to get together and figure out some kind of schedule. There's propane going to the stove, you know, there's some pots and pans, and here's some money for groceries, right? But we're not getting involved in it. And do you know the next day, this one grandma showed up and made breakfast, which she did every Monday, and the lunch, somebody else did it, and they just worked out their whole schedule, and next thing you know, like, I didn't have to mess with the kitchen at all, you know? And then people started coming by donating food, and then I didn't have to buy any food at all. It was weird. And I said, what was the difference? The difference is that we allowed somebody in that situation to have ownership and have to work for what they got. We didn't go in, you understand? Okay, so I started to feel differently and realize that my views were not so left of center after all. But I still wasn't one of you racist, conservative people with racial resentment and all this stuff, right? Because you had been so sufficiently demonized in my mind, as you are in a lot of people's minds. But anyways, so I started to see things differently. And then Acorn, 4 months after the storm, 4 months after, I've been on that dirt floor for 4 months at this point, right? Have been hospitalized. There was no hospital there until the military put in some type of emergent first aid station. Had staph infections from this muddy, dirty floor, right? And 4 months later, Acorn shows back up in New Orleans, which is where they started. There was a base. That's where the base was. And they said, well, listen, we're an association of community organizations. You need to come under our umbrella and raise money for us. And then we will distribute. And I said, well, here's the problem. None of your buddies are here doing any work. You guys still aren't even here. You have your offices aren't even open. You show up 1 day a week. You're not living here. You're asking me for a list of who's in the community because you haven't walked the streets. You haven't been living with these people. But these are my people. And it's like, call it what you want, but no one knows your name that I've been dealing with. And they're like, well, listen, Brandon, you're going to work under us. You're in a position of, we're going to say you have white supremacy issues and that you're a male in a position of white leadership who doesn't care about local black leadership and working with black leadership. You come on a white horse to save people. And I said, well, listen here, man. I'm the wrong dude for you to get that attitude with. Because here's what I'm going to say, is you're like the self-appointed black leadership who really only has white liberals and white academics behind you. And these black grandmothers and grandpas I've been working with, they are community leaders. The ones who stayed here to help people, they are black community leaders just because they don't like pump their fists in the air and talk about Malcolm X and your politics and support your candidates and do whatever you want them to do. Like, they are black leaders too. You don't get to decide who a black leader is and isn't. So I'm looking at actions and all I see, grandma and grandpa have been here the whole time and your lazy self has been gone, you know? Gone, talking about New Orleans and how it affects communities of color when you haven't even been here. you know? So I had this conflict with Acorn all of a sudden, you know? And I was like, man, I'm not getting along with any of the people that I've idealized and I care about, I've looked up to at all. Well, long story short, you know, I'm starting to feel differently. I hated pigs, the racist pigs, even if they were black, they were racist pigs, you know? The Mexican cops, racist pigs. And you think it's funny, but most people on the left feel that way. Or at least they hang out with people who do and they accept it. You know, they condone it or they are silent about that kind of radical stuff. Well, anyways, this one cop, the cops, man, they reinforced it and they didn't like me and da-da-da-da. But this one guy who was the captain of the 5th District, which is the 9th Ward, named John Bryson, he decided to reach out to me and be nice to me. You know? And I decided to be nice to him, so I had dinner with him, we started to associate, we started to help people. We started the first, crisis center for battered women. I still use that term, you're not taking that term away from me. We started the first crisis center for women who had been abused in New Orleans after the storm. It wasn't available, that was a whole nother story, where people got mad at me and like, well, we thought you were gonna work with black females in the community. I'm like, I am working with black females in the community. They're like, well, we had these grant proposals we were doing. I was like, well, but see, you're not here, I'm here. So when elderly women or women who have been beaten up are living in my volunteer housing because there's nowhere for them, this concept of you doing this and going around doing interviews and raising $1 million before we start something doesn't work well for me because it doesn't work well for the people I'm helping, right? So we just opened up the place and put sheets on the walls. People showed up and said, this is horrible. And I'm like, it's all that exists. Instead of complaining, would you just come and help? Instead of doing bad media stories about how horrible our shelter is, why don't you do stories about how people can come and help fix up our shelter? Or they can donate sheetrock, or they can donate their time. And they did. And so within a month, we had this really nice shelter going, right? Where if I had done it in the traditional way that the left of center, nonprofit industrial complex does it, it would have taken me a year, right? These people who are in solidarity with the hurting people in the world, they do things kind of slow, you know? Because they do things in these collective, it matters more to them the process and actually helping the person they're trying to help, right? So I began to feel very differently. I started to really get close to this cop, then I started to kind of, once the cop was humanized to me, then he wasn't a pig anymore. And then when people said things that weren't fair or unfair logic, it didn't work for me, right? And I was like, yeah, you say that about the cops, but that's not really fair because he was a human to me now, right? He wasn't dehumanized anymore. So once he and I worked together helping people and I saw his humanity and that dehumanization that I had been trained to have for this cop, for cops was gone, then I began to appreciate him, you know? We'll make a long story short, I don't want to bore you. I got invited to Venezuela by Hugo Chavez to get Chavez trailers for the people in New Orleans because America doesn't care. I went, and it was a creepy, long, strange story. But to make a long story short, what I noticed again was that first off, Medea Benjamin has her phone numbers on the speed dial list on the cell phones of all of President Chavez's former staff. That was creepy to me, right? That bothered me. One woman who worked for Global Exchange, which is Medea Benjamin's organization, and they do the freedom tours that Danny Glover and Sean Penn and everybody go on, you know, to look at the barrios and what he's doing that's so beautiful with the socialized oil money, right? One woman was like connected to Cuban intelligence, and so they were very interested in all this creepy stuff. Well, so when I got out of the 4 barrios off the government-sponsored tour, the taxpayer-funded tours that you pay for through Global Exchange, I'm sorry. When I got off the propaganda tours, I started to see a level of suffering I had never seen before in the world. And so I started to say things about it, you know? And I was like, hey, you know, like these people here, like you must have missed them because they don't have all this collective stuff going on that you have going on over here, you know? They don't have the Cuban doctors for oil and stuff, right? You know? They're like, yeah, well, we're getting there. Nothing's perfect. It's a process. It's a process. I'm like, okay. But I started to realize there was a lot of problems, so I started to be kind of vocal. Then it got really creepy. Long story short, I wanted to stay a week. They didn't let me leave. I stayed a month before they let me leave. When I got back to the United States, I was so happy. I literally kissed the ground. It was creepy. So then I said, you know, I don't think I want to hang out with these people anymore. I don't know what's going on in me, but I'm not like, I just don't fit in with these people. I'm very radical about helping people, but that doesn't make me a leftist, right? And I thought it did, and it doesn't. I don't believe in leftist policies, you know? Which leftist means you believe that a far, far away federal government staffed by superior people with PhDs who can properly interpret the data should set public policy so the rest of us live correctly. I am not that person. That is leftism. I am not that person. And I began to realize that. So I came back, long story short, when I came back, most of the radicals I had met from around the world, they couldn't accept that I was starting to back away from them. You know, they kept telling me their crazy stuff. One of them, named Riyad Hamad, told me some crazy stuff. He was a Palestinian, ran the largest Palestinian nonprofit. He was going to bomb Israeli children and civilians. I turned him into the FBI. He died, a horrible situation. I could go on. And a bunch of those happened, and then the FBI were like, man, we're really surprised that you're helping us. And I was like, well, yeah, man. I just see things I didn't see before. Here you go, yada, yada. Long story short, I spent the next 2 years undercover. It's natural, right? Everybody, like it just happens in life. With the International Terrorism Division of the Joint Terrorism Task Force of the FBI. And I developed this really bizarre relationship where I was, I guess, for all intents and purposes, an informant, but it doesn't really work like that, right? Like you have operational sort, you have all these different things that people do. And I got to be very close to a couple of people in the Bureau, and they started to use me to go undercover in international terrorism, and I was pretty good at doing it. And it was kind of weird because I got trusted because of who I was in the past, right? And who I associated with in the past. And that whole thing with the AK-47 and the Black Panthers in the house, even though that was not political in any way, it was because there was a group of jerks killing black people, and I took a stand against it. You know, there was nothing political. I wasn't trying to gonna march to Washington and kick the White House doors in or something. I just wanted them to stop doing what they were doing, you know, regardless of who it was, and I would do the same thing again now, if I had to. And I hope you would too. You know, if you saw that kind of injustice happening and there was nobody there to stop it, and you couldn't call anybody, you know? So my point is that stuff gave me a lot of credibility with radical people around the world. So I was pretty good with the counterterrorism stuff and international terrorism. I worked on a domestic case here in the United States at the Republican National Convention in 2008, and those people had set out with the explicit stated goal of shutting the RNC down by any means necessary. How many of you hear that and think, oh, well, that's their right? Anybody in here? Because that's not freedom of speech. That's a crime. That's violating the civil rights of others. That's a conspiracy to make sure that other groups of Americans do not get to exercise their constitutionally guaranteed rights simply because you feel superior to them. That's what that is. That's not okay, right? But they get away with it. So I decided to work on that case. I worked on that case, and lo and behold, it turns out that I'm getting wrapping up. I know I'm boring you. Okay, so check this out, right? This is what's so weird. 10,000 people protested the Republican Party in 2008 at the RNC, right? And that is so American of them to do that. It's American to protest whatever you want to protest. It really is. To voice your opinion, it's very American. I like that. The Tea Party movement voices their opinions. I like that. I like to see that. I like to see people on the street. I like to see people get involved with legislative processes as well and participate in the system that we have that allows them to make changes without blowing things up, which is why I'm not a leftist. But another reason, another reason to add to that list. But here's the deal. These 10,000 people were showing up and they were being organized. This is where we got to pay attention. They were being organized by a group called United for Peace and Justice. Okay. United for Peace and Justice has a 3-person steering committee. Now, one of those 3 people is guess who? Guess who? Whatever. I'm a writer for a living, but I have a GED. I have an excuse. Right. Guess who? Whom? Whatever. Lisa Fithian. Right? But now check this out. The 500 to 1,000 person anarchist black mass RNC welcoming committee, who was organizing to shut it down by any means necessary. Guess who was organizing that?
at least the 50. So you have the group, the people training and organizing the moderate, mainstream, liberal protesters are also the same people in person organizing the radical black bloc faction. Think about that for a second, right? Now check this out. In those meetings that I was privy to and inside of, because they thought, there's no way Brandon would ever work with the FBI. Well, wrong. I did. I really did. I guess I did pretty profoundly, huh? They know that now. In those meetings, they wanted to shut it down, and they had this plan to shut it down. And what they did was they took the XL Center, that's where the convention is going to be. And how many of you have ever been to a convention like that, a political convention? They have to bus delegates in, and the delegates get in and they pick the leader for that person we're going to vote for, right? You know, the person we can choose to vote for, the candidate. And they decided, the radicals on the left, that they were going to block the roadways that the buses would need to get to the convention, thus preventing the delegates from going, thus shutting the convention down, thus delegitimizing and shutting down one of two, maybe three, we could argue, legitimate political parties in the United States of America. So the way they decided to do it was they said, well, the cops aren't going to let us do it. So what Lisa said was this. She said, here's how we're going to do it. We're going to do it just like we did in Seattle in '99, which she also organized, by the way. At that point, she was working for the SCIU. But she still actually is their chief organizer, but we'll get there. She said, we're going to have 3 groups of people, red, yellow, and green. Okay? Red, yellow, and green. The yellow group is going to be the people who are going to get arrested for nonviolent civil disobedience. They're going to get in the roads, they're going to put their hands in PVC pipes, handcuff themselves together, right? And the cops aren't going to be able to cut them out without cutting them, which the cops aren't going to want to do, so it's going to take a really long time. And that's going to stop the buses from getting through. But then people said, well, yeah, but Lisa, we can't, the cops aren't going to let them do that. She goes, well, that's what the green group is for. Well, who's the green group, Lisa? The green group is the 10,000 protesters who won't realize that we're using them to cover for this behavior, this activity. So you have these liberal protesters who, when the whistle blows and people say, come in the street in the name of justice, people go, yeah, and they get in the street and the cops say, get out of the street, and they go, yes, sir, because they're law-abiding citizens. They're just liberals. They don't want to violate the law. They don't want to participate and interfere with the rights of others. They just want to voice their opinion, but they don't realize the people leading them are using them to cover for un-American, unconstitutional acts of crime against a whole half of the country. They don't realize it. So they're going to get the green group in the street, and when the cops say get out, the green group's going to listen. So they're going to try to slow the green group down, but ultimately the green group is going to obey the lawful order and get out of the street. So if that didn't give enough cover to the yellow group to lock down, then they call in the red group, the people with the black masks, the Occupy people, who are going to come in with black masks on, attack the police officers, and then they're going to flee, hopefully never getting arrested. Now that will for sure, between the green group and the red group, give the yellow group time to lock down. All the while, the green group thinks that that's some other people in the protest we have nothing to do with, when the truth is if it wasn't for the green group being manipulated, the leadership could never have blocked the roads. You understand? Do you get it? So I infiltrated the red group, right? The people who set out to do that. They made shields, they made sticks, they had signs, like their signs that like we have, but their signs had these huge axe handles holding up the signs, because you can't take it away because it's freedom of expression, right? But it's a weapon, and they used it as weapons, and they made shields out of its traffic codes. They just made riot shields, that's all. No, they had sharpened deck screws sticking out, so when the cops tried to push against them, they could hurt the cops, and the cops couldn't do anything. Long story short, the cops go in and they take all those shields, they find them, thank you, I told them where it was. And they found them, and they found all these sticks, and they took the sticks before they could be put on signs, because then they couldn't have taken the sticks. And these people got so mad, they made molotov cocktails to bomb Republican delegates and law enforcement officers at the RNC. Long story short, I worked in the intelligence end, not the criminal justice end, So I was never supposed to have my identity come out. But the problem was, is other people got burned, other people got scared, other people backed away, and so the FBI said, Brandon, we got a problem. We can't get a warrant unless we use your name. I was like, well, we can't do that. And they're like, yeah, we don't really. And some of them wanted me to, some of them didn't. I decided the next day that I probably should. They said, well, probably they're going to just accept the guilty pleas because we know the stuff's in there. That's going to be okay, but your name might come out, you might have to testify. It's going to totally change your life. But that probably won't happen. And I was like, oh my gosh, can I have a little while to think about it? They're like, not long. So I said, okay. I thought about it and I said, okay, I'm going to do it. I don't want to, but I probably should, right? So I did. They got the warrants, they kicked in the door, boom, 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 whatever. Found the bombs. One guy pleads guilty, says, yeah, I did it, I made bombs. You know. Then the other guy says, the FBI made them and planted them. And I said, uh-oh. And do you know that that person kept his story? He doesn't anymore. Now he went back to it. Long story. Not exactly. But that person kept his story, and he alleged that the FBI planted the bombs, and the entire radical left got behind him. And not only did the entire radical left, but the Green Group did too. The New York Times started it off. You'd think the story in the New York Times would be peace and justice movement spawns bomb plots, right? Ew. The story was, peace and justice activists feel betrayed at their government's infiltration. And now here's the deal. You don't do anything wrong, you shouldn't be infiltrated, but if you're doing that kind of stuff, law enforcement, government owes it to me and my rights to watch you. I mean, that's crazy, you know? That's crazy stuff, right? And the guy kept that narrative, and then people were believing it, and the paper was quoting it, and all the papers started going, and all of a sudden Brandon, who had started women's shelters, was never a dang thing bad written about me on the internet, out of hundreds of interviews and stuff. All of a sudden I wasn't a co-founder of Common Ground anymore. All of a sudden I was a womanizer, abusive, evil, gun-toting, right-wing extremist, skinhead, possibly Nazi. I mean, evil stuff, violent, I beat people up. You know, I kicked the door in of a women's shelter to throw out a man who was staying there. And it's like, I did do that. Like, let's think about it. I kicked the door in of a women's shelter that I started and ran in the absence of law enforcement to throw a man out who, yes, a man who was staying there. Let's talk about that, you know? But I wasn't in trouble for that. In fact, John Bryson, who was the captain of the district, asked me to because he didn't have enough people to go get the guy out. He was held up, defecating and smoking crack, and they kicked all the women out of the women's shelter. And I was like, yeah, you're gonna go. Now. And then I got him, nicely, and I got his ear. I got him out. But I'm not ashamed of that. But the point is that they took all this stuff and they were trying to discredit my testimony. The New York Times did it, everybody did it. And then I was like, oh, why don't y'all say something? Like, you gotta say something. These people are attacking everything about me. So they released a little information and showed that we didn't plant bombs. So then, I go to bed that night, and I thought, okay, I'm justified, I'm vindicated, or whatever. I'm gonna wake up tomorrow and people realize what really happened. It's gonna be uncomfortable to testify, but it's gonna be okay. Well, I wake up, and lo and behold, there was a whole separate narrative. The separate narrative was that under our control, we broke them and beat them down so much emotionally to make them Manchurian candidates, that they would make these bombs under our direction and control. Well, then the media went with that, and I was like, well, wait a minute, why are you going with that? You just had a completely separate narrative. This guy said a completely separate thing the other day, and you guys went with that, and now it turns out he's a liar. You don't even mention that in today's story, and you're just attacking me. You know, it reminds me of how they do George Zimmerman. I don't know how you feel about that case, but it reminds me of how they do George Zimmerman, where they take pictures. The pictures of me were me like, and the picture that these guys, thank you. The pictures of these guys are in their mid-20s, right? They didn't use those pictures in the media. You know what picture they used? Them when they were 15, 16, and 12. They were so cute. Them with their little football jersey. And I'm like, why are you going to do something like that? This guy's 25 years old, and you got his picture when he's 12 in a football jersey. These kids were busted by the FBI. And I was like, oh boy, I'm in trouble. Long story short, they released a little more information, and the guys changed the story again. The guy changes the story again. Then he says I entrapped him. We go to trial. half the jury thought it was possible that he got because he claimed that I mentioned it to him and that he got the idea from me. Yeah, I kind of do. I was trying to be all cool and be like, no, keep talking and get on over. But it didn't work out for me. Okay, so half the jury believed it, half didn't. But it turns out that at this point we were under the Polar Justice Department. So what they did was they had 210 hours of recorded phone calls of this guy talking about it as the narrative changed from prison and from jail, right? But they had only assigned resources to go through 4 hours of the evidence. So finally, the Bureau, on their own volition, goes through the 210 hours of calls and transcribes, and it turns out all of it's there, and he apparently, I guess when you're in jail and you talk for hours, you forget that you can't say things, and he just talked pretty openly, and he admitted the whole stuff, and that he made it up, and all this crazy stuff, and it's all right there. He doesn't realize they have that, you know, because apparently his defense attorney didn't go through the 210 hours either. Which I can understand that. That's a lot of money and resources, you know. But not the millions something they spent on the trial. Actually, they wasted a lot of your money. And they wasted a lot of my life. Actually, hold on, I'm getting mad. No, I'm not getting mad. The point is the men and the women of the Bureau did the right thing. They went through the information, regardless of the fact that they were busy doing other stuff. You know, they had, these guys do counterterrorism. They're kind of busy these days, right? Believe it or not, they really are. Really, really are. Like good men and women. The Patriots, except for a couple, but the majority of them are. And all the info was there, so the guy wouldn't plead guilty. They warned him that he better plead guilty. He wouldn't. So in the morning of court, they announced what they had, handed it to the defense attorney. He goes, well, I don't have this. He goes, well, we gave it to you, just didn't transcribe it, but we just transcribed it, so we didn't have to give it to you until right now. So the judge took that, and the guy said, I want to plead guilty. He said, I lied. He said, I embellished. Okay, I actually lied when I said that Brandon Darby and the FBI came up with the idea to make molotov cocktails. I lied. That's what he said. And you think he's guilty, he goes to jail, gets his sentence eventually, and you think, well, that's, you know, that's good, right? It's over, right? People know. It wasn't over. It wasn't over because when that narrative was going on, George Soros and PBS started funding a film called Better This World. You won't like me if you watch it. Well, if you're a liberal, if you're on the conservative side, you'll probably get mad at it because your tax dollars funded part of it. And they made this film that alleged that I had set them up, and the FBI set them up to justify George Bush's counterterrorism budget. But I figured the film wouldn't be done, wouldn't happen anymore now that they knew the truth. That's not the case. So they come up with this film and it says, Better This World, the story of two childhood friends who set out to better the world until they met the FBI and protest George Bush's policies until they met the FBI's Brandon Darby, whose performance of hypermasculinity made it inevitable that young men in my presence would want to make bombs to prove their manhood and blow up cops and Republicans, right? But then the whole blowing up cops and Republicans thing, that got taken out of the narrative too. They made a couple of Molotov cocktails to throw at empty police cars that they never were going to use, they say. And it's like, okay, whatever. They're just so human, and I'm so bad, and the FBI is so bad, the pigs are so bad, right? That's how they do it. And so I decided at that point, rather than be quiet, and they wanted me to go in witness protection. I did not, obviously. And I decided at that point that I was going to fight back. So when asked what I thought, I said it was an honor to serve my country by working with the good men and women of the FBI and protecting the rights and safety of other Americans. And they're like, blah, you know, they can't stand that. Like, you're a snitch, and I'm like, well, technically I'm not. Actually, I was what's called an operational source. That's what I said. You know, like, you're an agent provocateur. I'm like, no, I'm not an agent provocateur. I'm an agent saboteur. That's what I did, right? Like when there were bad terrorism guys and they couldn't bust them because it would reveal something and ruin a bigger thing, then I got to sit in and try to interfere with that action and not let them do it, right? That's not provocateur. That's saboteur. You know? And they're like, ah! And so I just started talking back. But here's the problem. Sometimes media outlets just wouldn't print what I was saying. And they would like take little things I said and twist it into things I didn't say. Sometimes there were interviews that surfaced that I never gave, and they said I gave them, mainstream outlets. And I was like, this isn't right. I had no voice. If I left comments on blogs, they'd take them off. Or they'd disable comments, you know? I couldn't fight back. But then NPR and This American Life, they decided, National Public Radio decided to do a hit on me. Some people say it's very fair, and I'm like, you voted for Obama, didn't you? And they're like, I did, how'd you know? I'm like, I'm glad you liked the show Turncoats that they did about me. You know, Turncoats. I don't like that, you know? Because really, if you think about it, I was born an American, and then I was a leftist turncoat, right? And so all I really did was get back to what I was when I was born, right? An American. That's all I did. So actually, they're the turncoats. But anyways, they called me a turncoat, whatever. They did a long show. Some of it was interesting. It gave me back the fact that I co-founded a relief organization. It gave me back the fact that I wasn't a serial killer or whatever they were saying. You know, it did throw a couple jabs in there, like that were not fair, but that's okay. But they attacked me. Well, here's what happened. Are y'all bored yet? No. Okay. So I'm out of my mind. I'm not gonna say I have PTSD, but I'll say this. When you do some of that stuff, you like to sleep with TVs on sometimes, you know? And sometimes you get stressed out. Like, I don't like to talk about New Orleans, right? Like, you know, and it's not at all compared to what people who went through Vietnam went through when they served in Vietnam, but I'm gonna tell you, you know how sometimes people who went through Vietnam don't like to talk about Vietnam and they get real mad? Like, that's kind of how I feel about it. I just don't like to talk about some of it, you know? It feels weird to me. It doesn't make me happy, and I get kind of anxiety-ridden and stuff. And, you know, so I went and I was able, because it was getting foreclosed on and it was a relative, I was able to get this 2 acres with this nice house out in the country. Old house, but nice, right? And had to fix a lot of it, which I know how to do that stuff, right? I like to do that stuff. Because I'm a blue-collar guy with a GED from Pasadena, Texas, who somehow has become a professional writer. I don't know how. You know, I'm serious. I'll tell you what. So I get this land. I start planting at that point, I'm friends with a lot of cops, obviously. The people I used to call pigs that I now realize I was so wrong about, you know, in their service. And they're all nice to me, right? And I'm nice to them. And one of them says, Brandon, you're not okay, man. You need to go play in the garden. You need to turn your phone off, call your mom, your grandma, and a couple other people every day, and just go play in the garden, bro, and just step away, you know? It's okay. I'm like, you know? I'm like, or you can go to my doctor. He gives me Xanax. I'm like, I'm not doing that. I don't want pills. Thank you. I take aspirin, you know? I drink coffee and I smoke cigarettes. That's the bad things I do, but I don't want any of that, you know? I don't want that. I don't want to be like, I don't want to do that, right? Because I see too many friends who are soldiers and who are cops and who had to shoot someone or something. They do that, you know? And then they do it all the time. And then they always need to do it, so I didn't want to do that. So I planted a garden, and I got some chickens, and I learned how to, I learned some animal husbandry. I got a couple goats and some pigs, right? I raised a pig, and I killed the pig, and I ate the pig. I made bacon. And I had like 300 pounds of pig. And I was like, really? So anyways, my point is that I had decided to fight back, and I had decided to take some space out in the country and not to leave and not to run away and get witness protection. And I decided that I was going to save up a little bit, and I did. It was hard to make a living, though, because I live in a very liberal area, and I'm Satan or the Antichrist or something to them, you know? And so it obviously affected my ability to make a living, but I got a little money together, and I bought this old Ford 1973 F-150. You know what that is? It's a cool truck. And it was a little rough, but I got it. Well, then I get home, and it turns out, check this out. This guy I bought the truck from was dorm mates in college with this conservative guy named Andrew Breitbart. And so I get this call, and he's like, Brandon, this is Andrew Breitbart. I was like, yeah? Hello? And he was like, thank you. And I was like, what are you talking about? He was like, thanks for what you did. I'm like, are you serious? I was like, well, you're welcome. You know, you're the first person to tell me that. He goes, why don't you fight back? I said, are you kidding me? I do fight back. They won't print what I say. And he said, well, I'm about to start a new site called Big Government, and you can write whatever you want on that site, and I'm not going to edit your words. I said, we're going to have to edit my words because you don't understand. He goes, well, I'm not going to edit your thoughts. And I said, okay. And I said, I'll think about it, Andrew. And then he and I became really good friends, you know, and I got to finally write about whenever Wade Rathke, the founder of Acorn, because remember he didn't like me from New Orleans, remember that? The Acorn stuff, and I'm a white guy, and he's a white guy too, it turns out. But I'm different, because I'm a racist white, I don't know whatever he thinks. So when all the FBI stuff comes out, he decides, it's a shame that Brandon Darby snitched on his friends. That's what he said. That's what he said about stopping people from burning and maiming Republicans and cops. So when all that Acorn stuff busted with Hannah Giles and James O'Keefe and Andrew on Big Government, on the Big Government's first day, remember that? Yeah, I was honored to have like the third piece that went up, that how Wade Rathke said it implied it was a shame that Republicans and cops didn't get burned and maimed, you know, for their views. And then I was really honored whenever like a bunch of Republican folks in the House started passing that article out, and I got wind of it, you know, to the different lawmakers when they were voting on Acorn's funding. So I wanted to look at Acorn and Wade and just be like, so then Andrew got me on Twitter, which changed my life. And I tweeted at Wade, and I was like, how about them apples? I felt good. But the point was, I started fighting back. I couldn't write at all, right? And like, I could not write. I'm telling you, I could not write. I could talk, but I could not write. And he's like, I have editors, it's okay. Well, those poor editors. Like, even to this day, some of them, I feel bad for them. Because like sometimes, like, Brandon, that's not the right word, bro. It means this. I'm like, oh yeah, I meant this word. Like, that's not what you wrote. And then that word you meant isn't right either. Like, oh, I'm sorry, man. You know? So I have to, they have to work with me. But now I've become a fairly decent writer. Like, I have pretty good story. My story was the lead today. I don't even notice that. It was, I found this morning. It was the Mexican Gulf cartel sent people into the United States to kidnap a guy who stole 100 kilograms of cocaine from him, bring him back for execution, but they accidentally got the wrong dude. So this guy's with his wife, and these men show up saying they're cops, handcuff him, wrap him up, beat him up, take him to a ranch on U.S. soil that the Gulf cartel uses. They realize, oh, this guy's an innocent guy. This guy's like, I don't know who you're talking about. I'm just here working. I'm a legal resident. And they're like, yeah, sorry, we're going to have to kill you anyways. So then they smuggle him back across our porous border, across the Rio Grande, and they've never heard from him since. So I wrote that story today, and it stayed in the lead position all day. So I get to write, and I get to research, and I get to do the things that I like to do and have a voice, but I was not a writer. I did concrete work, and I was an activist, right? And I help people. Well, so now what I do, if I'm about to be done, don't get worried. You get to go home soon. So you have stuff in the crock pot. My stew's in the crock pot, hurry up. I'm trying. I can't help myself. But so now what I do is, you know, I don't really write about politics. I write about human issues and activist stuff and human rights stuff, you know. Like, when I think of the border, obviously because of my FBI stuff, I think about national security. But I also think about human trafficking, you know. I think about all the people who get brought across that border, who are unsafe to be brought across that border. That's a story I wrote the day before today, which was yesterday. And that was a story about the UN finally admitted that men from Somalia, which is a terror nation with terror camps controlled predominantly by Al-Shabaab, for $7,500, they fly to Central America, and then from there, the cartels take them on the same path that Mexican citizens and Central Americans use to come into the United States illegally. I found that to be concerning. Maybe all of us knows it happens, right? But you guys, that whole thing about documenting it, well, the UN saying it kind of helped. But my point is that I think about security stuff, and I write about security stuff, but I primarily look at things from human rights issues or just humanity issues, you know? So I like to go around and like to find good things that Tea Parties do or others do that are not dependent on government, right? Things that like actually encourage a culture of giving and helping and doing things, and not things that encourage dependence on government, which I think actually doesn't help for the most part in the long term. So that's where I come from. I write about that. I get to travel. I get to go to Mexico, which you say you get to. It's like everybody gets to, but I actually do it. And I have kind of a little radical style. Like I was writing to consulates and I was like, I'd like to interview a military commander in your country, and and nobody paid attention to me. So I finally go to Laredo, I walked across the border, I walked up to this soldier with a mask on his face, and I was like, ¿Dónde es tu comandante? He's like, huh? And I was like, take me to your leader, where is your leader? He's like, huh? And I was like, tus comandante, tus jefe, ¿Dónde? He's like, and he takes me to this concrete, but long story, I got this interview after a bunch of people said stuff to me, I have no idea what they were saying, very angrily, in a concrete bunker building. This guy finally came in, he spoke a little English, I got to interview him, right? I spoke a little Spanish, it worked out, right? And I had this really good interview about what was going on in Mexico, on the border. And so that kind of in-your-face journalism, or like the Occupy stuff, just kind of getting in there and talking to people, really is all it is. That's what I do. And another thing I do is I run a shelter for human trafficking victims. And believe it or not, most of it is funded or helped by. It doesn't really take any funding because it's my house. I know you say, that's weird, you open your house up as a shelter. I do. I'm careful about who I let in my house. You know, I don't just let whoever in my house, but I do let people in my house I often don't know. But the way my house is structured is I still have it set up where I have my own little private area, and then I have an area for other people. So right now I have 4 people in my house. All of them are, 2 of them are human trafficking victims. And it's always so weird for, remember that thing I said about John Bryson, the cop, remember? And how I thought cops were pigs because they had been dehumanized, until he and I started helping people together, and then he became a human to me, you know? He wasn't a monster, he wasn't dehumanized any longer, and once he wasn't dehumanized, then it was just argument versus argument, right? Perspective versus perspective. There was no more dehumanization to hide behind, to think he was a pig and not listen to what he had to say. Remember that? Okay, so check this out. A lot of times I have people from Mexico, not illegally, they're here legally. A lot of them were brought into this country against their will, and believe it or not, that actually happens as forced labor, which means slaves. And then when they finally get out, they are of interest to law enforcement. Law enforcement says, would you please stay? And they usually say, I don't want to. And then law enforcement says, will you please stay and testify against these bad guys who did this to you so we can stop them from doing it to others? And they usually say, I don't want to. It's a misnomer to think everybody in the world wants to live here. Some people really want to go back to their family's farm, you know? And Guatemala or in the south, you know, people want to go. And they decide to stay and do the right thing. Kind of the situation I got, like, I don't want to, but I probably should, right? And so while they stay, they are entitled to what's called a T visa or other types of visas, but they get to stay. And they testify for the government to stop bad guys from hurting people here and violating their laws. So that's usually the people who come to my house, you know. I try to bring awareness to them. And when I'm working with them, a lot of times some of them don't speak English. So I have to go to these churches where people don't speak English, right? To get them involved in communities. And these people are like this Tejano church in my house, they're like, wait, you're a Tea Party? What? And I'm like, yeah. And they're like, dude, we thought y'all were racist. And I'm like, no, man. He's like, I'm sorry, man, wait, okay, you're a Tea Party. And then you have this woman in your house who doesn't speak English from Guatemala. And I'm like, yes. And I need you to help me help her, because I can't speak her language. I'm very poor. I'm like, hola, ¿cómo estás, señorita? You know, like, our señora. Like, I don't speak that great, you know? So, well, they're like, okay, we'll help, dude. And they get involved, and then that dehumanization breaks down, right? And then we can hear perspectives, you know? See what I mean? And there's some issues that you're just not going to get involved in, you know? Like, you just can't, because you've been so dehumanized. Half the country thinks you're a white supremacist, you secretly wear sheets in a Klan meeting or something. But there's some issues that are actually very congruent with what we believe. For instance, like human trafficking, you know? You say, that's a misnomer, that doesn't really happen. Oh yeah, it does. I didn't mention this. I went back, that's my little girl. She's telling me to hurry. Hi. Here's the deal. So I went back undercover, again. It was kind of funny because the DC office was like, he has to stop working undercover. You still have him open? His identity's out there. So they shut me down, and then another office opened me up. And then I worked in violent crimes for a while and did other stuff, and then they were like, what? Shut him down. So then another office opened me up. And then I worked undercover in human trafficking. you know? And believe it or not, that still happens in this country. And freedom and liberty is something that's very congruent with what we believe in. I believe in our Constitution, our Declaration of Independence, law and order. So that's what I do. And I'm eternally grateful that Andrew found me and worked with me and really encouraged me. You know, one time I wrote an article for Town Hall, and you're like, why didn't you like it? Well, they don't like big, long articles, that's why. And I had a lot to say. It was for the anniversary of Andrew's passing, for his death. It was called The Legacy of Andrew Breitbart, a Warrior and a Friend. And I talked in there a lot about, you know, he and I got pretty close, and at one point he said, why do you do this, man? And I said, you know, honestly, man, I mean, like, you know, I guess I'm supposed to say, well, my country and my this and my that, and that's true, right? Like, I think you guys need to realize that the average liberal does not realize that they're being used, you know? Not all of them are, but the red, yellow, green thing is pretty descriptive of how they do a lot of things they organize in, right? Whether it be voter ID, whether it be, I mean, that's how they do things. And I said, you know, but the biggest reason that I started to fight was because I didn't want that little girl, like I thought I was gonna die. I was like, okay, the Palestinian thing, the anarchist, like, okay, I'm in trouble, right? I thought there was a chance. I still sometimes think that, right? When I write about certain people, like, especially cartels, and I go to Mexico. But I thought I might be in some trouble, right? Thought I might die, or they might do something to me. And I was worried that that little girl would grow up, and all she would have to read about her daddy was what those people said about me, you know? I was really worried about that, you know? And Andrew said, brother, I'm gonna make you whole, I promise you, I'm gonna make you whole. And he did. I realized that when he died. That night I called him. I'm not gonna get into the details of that. I'm just gonna tell you, like, I called him that night, and it's a long story short, but the night that he passed, and I'm not gonna go there. What I'll tell you is this. Shortly after that, I was touring the country, having all these really cool experiences. It was really stressful to tour, but I ended up on a lot of beaches for like 6 hours, or I had 4 hours to go to a beach, or, you know, and just have all these really neat experiences and meet people around the country. And I was in this motel room, and I was in Tennessee when it happened. And I wake up, and I just realized, I was like, Andrew kept his promises. He really did. You know, he kept his promises to me. I'm like in a great position, you know, especially compared to the other people who have been through what I've gone through. I mean, I just am. I'm just saying. Like, one of my friends that I grew up with just got hit by a car last week. She had her funeral here in Houston, you know, and she was no doubt on drugs. You know, maybe not, but she probably was because she had addiction problems, you know. And like, so a lot of these people that I grew up with did, like, one of them robbed a PORN store for drug money and got shot, you know? I mean, that's how these people's lives turned out, and mine didn't, right? And so now I'm in a position where I can advocate and help people in a way that I've never really been able to before. And it's all because Andrew worked with me. I think God has something to do with that, but you might not, whatever. But in human terms, it's all because Andrew, for no good reason, he didn't need me, but he advocated for and promoted me. He never said, look what I wrote and did. He always talked about, hey, I did this, but look what these guys are doing. Look how great these people are, right? And that's what he always did for me and for a lot of other people. So I realized that he had kept his promise. And I try to keep that alive. You know, right now I don't want to tour and talk, but I definitely want to keep writing. And I definitely want to tell you that, you know, something that's not common in our movement, unfortunately, in any political movement, is, I want to close with this, you know, it's remembering to promote the people around you instead of yourself, you know, and help other people. Because really that's all, the only way you're going to have enough people who are good people to do right in this world is by promoting other people who you see doing good. And the only way that you're going to overcome that dehumanization and you're going to defend liberty is to help other people and work with other people who have different perspectives to do it. Hey guys, thanks for having me.
What an inspiration. Did you love that? Yeah. One of our rallies. And he did exactly, he had Hannah Giles, she's from here. And he did exactly what he said. Gave them a whole lot of credit. Gave credit to you guys for all the stuff that has happened. And if without him, would that have happened? He was a really special person. You're a really special person. It takes a few special people to show up and make things happen. And Andrew did that. And Brandon does that. And you guys are doing that.